Hey guys, tonight we begin with something controversial, something that's been both sacred medicine and public enemy number one, depending on who you ask and when you ask them. We're talking about cannabis. The plant that's been cultivated for over 10,000 years, used by emperors and outlawed by presidents, prescribed by doctors and demonized by politicians. A plant so versatile it's been rope, medicine, recreation, and scapegoat all at once. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a simple truth that somehow got lost in decades of propaganda. Cannabis isn't some modern drug invented by hippies in the 1960s. It's one of humanity's oldest cultivated plants. Archaeological evidence shows humans have been growing and using cannabis since at least 8,000 BCE. That's right. 10,000 years ago, while most of humanity was still figuring out basic agriculture, someone looked at this leafy green plant and said, yeah, this one. This one's special. And they weren't wrong. Cannabis sativa is a remarkably versatile plant. The fibers from its stalks can be woven into rope strong enough to hold sailing ships together. The seeds are packed with protein and healthy fats. The leaves and flowers contain compounds that can ease pain, reduce inflammation, and yes, alter consciousness. For thousands of years, cannabis wasn't controversial. It was useful. Essential, even. Ancient civilizations from China to India to the Middle East cultivated it, traded it, and wrote about it. It appears in medical texts, religious ceremonies, and agricultural records. It wasn't hidden or stigmatized. It was just another plant. A really, really valuable plant. Hemp cloth clothed peasants and kings alike. Hemp rope held together the rigging of ships that explored new worlds. Hemp paper recorded the thoughts of philosophers and the laws of empires. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean politically complicated. Because cannabis wasn't always just hemp. The psychoactive properties of the plant, specifically the compound THC found in the flowers, were also well known to ancient peoples. And they didn't freak out about it. They used it medicinally. They used it spiritually. They used it recreationally. And the world kept spinning. So what changed? How did a plant that was woven into the fabric of human civilization, literally and figuratively, become one of the most prohibited substances on earth? How did medicine become a crime? How did farmers become felons? The answer isn't scientific. It's not medical. It's political. And it's ugly. Tonight, we're going to trace the history of cannabis from ancient China to modern America. We'll meet the emperors who prescribed it, the shamans who smoked it, the soldiers who relied on it, and the politicians who weaponized it. We'll uncover the racism, the propaganda, and the corporate interests that turned a plant into public enemy number one. Because the history of cannabis isn't really about a plant. It's about power. About who gets to decide what's medicine and what's a crime. About how fear and prejudice can be packaged as science. And about how something used safely for thousands of years can be demonized in just a few decades. So settle in. Because the story of cannabis is long, strange, and darker than you might expect. And it starts 5,000 years ago, in the mountains of Central Asia, where nomadic warriors discovered something that would change their world forever. Let's go back. Way back. To around 2700 BCE, in ancient China. The legendary Emperor Shen Nung, often called the father of Chinese medicine, was cataloging hundreds of plants for their medicinal properties. He tested them on himself, because apparently ancient emperors had a very hands-on approach to pharmacology. And among all those plants, he found cannabis particularly interesting. Shen Nung's writings, later compiled into texts like the Pen Tsao Ching, describe cannabis as a treatment for over 100 different ailments. Gout, rheumatism, malaria, poor memory, and yes, even female weakness, whatever that meant in ancient China. The plant was called ma, and it was considered one of the fundamental herbs in Chinese medicine. Not some fringe remedy. Fundamental. But the Chinese didn't just use cannabis for medicine. They used hemp fibers to make clothing, rope, and paper. In fact, some of the oldest known paper in the world, dating back to around 100 BCE, was made from hemp. So when you think about the spread of ideas, literature, and knowledge in ancient China, remember that a lot of it was literally written on cannabis. Now let's travel west, to ancient India, around 1000 BCE. Here, cannabis wasn't just medicine. It was sacred. The plant appears in the Vedas, ancient Hindu scriptures, where it's described as one of the 5 sacred plants. It was called bhang, and it was associated with the god Shiva, who according to legend, loved to consume it. Hindu holy men, sadhus, smoked and consumed cannabis as part of their spiritual practice. It wasn't recreational in the modern sense. It was sacramental. They believed it brought them closer to the divine, helped them meditate for hours, and gave them insights into the nature of reality. And this wasn't some small cult. This was mainstream religious practice. Even today, in certain Hindu festivals like Holi, consuming bhang is traditional and entirely legal in India. The ancient Indians also used cannabis medicinally. It appears in Ayurvedic texts as a treatment for pain, digestive issues, and insomnia. They mixed it into drinks, made it into pastes, and yes, smoked it. And nobody panicked. Nobody called it a dangerous drug. It was just part of life. But perhaps the most fascinating ancient cannabis users were the Scythians. These were nomadic warriors who roamed the steppes of Central Asia around 500 BCE. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about them, and his descriptions are wild. According to Herodotus, the Scythians had a ritual where they would build small tent-like structures, throw cannabis seeds and flowers onto hot stones inside, and then sit in the tent inhaling the smoke. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the Scythians would howl with pleasure from the vapor bath. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't spiritual. This was a group of ancient warriors getting absolutely baked in what was essentially the world's first hotbox. And Herodotus didn't write about it like it was scandalous. He wrote about it like it was just another interesting cultural practice. Archaeological evidence backs this up. In 2019, researchers found ancient wooden braziers in Scythian tombs in the Pamir Mountains. Chemical analysis showed cannabinoid residue with high THC content. These weren't using hemp. They were using potent psychoactive cannabis. In burial rituals, in celebrations, in their daily lives. So here's what we know. 5,000 years ago, across multiple continents, multiple civilizations independently discovered cannabis and decided it was valuable. Not dangerous. Not criminal. Valuable. The Chinese used it for medicine and industry. The Indians used it for spirituality and healing. The Scythians used it for ritual and, let's be honest, probably just for fun. And all of these ancient peoples wrote about it, traded it, and passed down their knowledge. Cannabis wasn't a secret. It wasn't taboo. It was normal. So the question isn't why ancient people used cannabis. The question is why we stopped. Or more accurately, why we were told to stop. But we'll get to that. First, we need to talk about how cannabis became one of the most important medicines in the world. And how doctors in the 1800s prescribed it for almost everything. So we've established that ancient civilizations loved cannabis. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because cannabis didn't just stay in ancient history. It became one of the most prescribed medicines in the Western world. And I'm not talking about some fringe alternative medicine. I'm talking about mainstream, doctor-prescribed, pharmacy-sold medicine. Let's jump to the Islamic Golden Age, around 800 to 1000 CE. While Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages, Islamic scholars were preserving and expanding ancient knowledge. And cannabis was part of that knowledge. Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote extensively about cannabis in his medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine. He described it as a treatment for headaches, inflammation, and infections. He noted both its therapeutic benefits and its potential for abuse if used excessively. This wasn't propaganda. This was clinical observation. Avicenna's work influenced medicine for centuries, and cannabis was right there in the pharmacopoeia, alongside other legitimate medicines. Fast forward to the 1800s. The Victorian era. An age of corsets, propriety, and apparently, a lot of cannabis. In 1839, a British surgeon named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy returned from India with detailed notes on cannabis use in Indian medicine. He'd witnessed its effectiveness for pain relief, muscle spasms, and seizures. And he was convinced it could help British patients. O'Shaughnessy began conducting experiments and publishing his findings. The medical establishment was intrigued. By the 1840s, cannabis tinctures and extracts were being sold in British and American pharmacies. You could walk into any respectable chemist and buy cannabis indica extract. No prescription needed. No stigma attached. What did doctors prescribe it for? Everything. And I mean everything. Menstrual cramps. Migraines. Insomnia. Muscle spasms. Epilepsy. Pain from childbirth. Even hysteria, which was basically the Victorian medical term for woman having emotions we don't understand. Cannabis was the aspirin of the 19th century. Queen Victoria herself was prescribed cannabis by her personal physician, Sir Russell Reynolds, for menstrual pain. The Queen of the British Empire, the most powerful woman in the world, was using cannabis. And nobody called her a criminal. Nobody said she had a drug problem. It was just medicine. Pharmaceutical companies jumped on board. Eli Lilly, Park Davis, and Squibb all produced cannabis extracts. They advertised them in medical journals. Doctors recommended them. Patients bought them. This wasn't some underground black market. This was legal, regulated, mainstream medicine. But here's the thing. Cannabis wasn't perfect as a 19th century pharmaceutical. The potency varied wildly depending on the plant source. Dosing was inconsistent. You couldn't always predict how strong a particular tincture would be. And as new synthetic drugs were developed, like aspirin in 1899 and barbiturates in the early 1900s, cannabis started to look old-fashioned. Still, it remained in the pharmacopoeia. The United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of drugs, listed cannabis from 1850 to 1942. That's nearly a century of recognition as legitimate medicine. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacies stocked it. Patients used it. And for most of that time, nobody questioned it. So what happened? How did medicine become a crime? How did something prescribed by doctors to Queen Victoria end up classified as a dangerous drug with no medical value? The answer isn't medical. It's not scientific. It's political. And it starts with racism, corporate interests, and a man named Harry Anslinger. But before we get to the villain of our story, we need to understand one more thing. Cannabis wasn't just medicine. It was also deeply woven into religious and spiritual practices around the world. And those practices are way older and way weirder than you might think. Let's talk about something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Cannabis as a religious sacrament. Not medicine. Not rope. But a direct pathway to the divine. Because for thousands of years, across multiple religions and spiritual traditions, cannabis was considered sacred. We already mentioned the Hindu sadhus and their connection to Shiva. But let's go deeper. In ancient India, cannabis wasn't just tolerated in religious practice. It was central to it. The Atharva Veda, one of the four Vedas, calls cannabis one of the 5 sacred plants and refers to it as a source of happiness and a liberator. During religious festivals, particularly Maha Shivaratri and Holi, consuming bhang, a cannabis drink mixed with milk, spices, and honey, is not just acceptable. It's traditional. Devotees believe it brings them closer to Shiva, helps them transcend the material world, and opens their consciousness to spiritual truths. This practice continues today. Legally. In a country with over 1 billion people. Now let's travel to ancient Persia and the Zoroastrian tradition. Some scholars believe that hauma, a sacred plant mentioned in Zoroastrian texts, may have been cannabis. The texts describe hauma as a plant that brings enlightenment, heals the sick, and connects humans with the divine. Zoroastrian priests consumed it in rituals. Whether it was cannabis or another psychoactive plant, the principle remains. Sacred plants for sacred purposes. Here's where it gets controversial. Some researchers argue that cannabis may have been used in ancient Israelite religious practices. In 1936, Polish etymologist Sula Benetoa proposed that cannabis, mentioned in the Old Testament as an ingredient in holy anointing oil, was actually cannabis. The recipe appears in Exodus chapter 30. God gives Moses instructions for creating holy anointing oil using myrrh, cinnamon, cassia, olive oil, and cannabis. Traditional translations render cannabis as calamus, a marsh plant. But Benetoa argued the word more accurately translates to cannabis. She pointed out that cannabis was widely cultivated in the region, was known for its aromatic properties, and the linguistic connection was stronger than the calamus theory. If she's right, and that's a big if, it means ancient Hebrew priests were anointing themselves with cannabis-infused oil during sacred ceremonies. It means the temple rituals, the consecration of priests, even the anointing of kings, involved cannabis. Modern scholars are divided. Some dismiss it as pseudoscience. Others find the linguistic and historical evidence compelling. We may never know for certain. But the possibility is fascinating. Moving forward in time, we find cannabis in Rastafarian practice. Rastafari, which emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, considers cannabis a sacred herb. They call it ganja, or the holy herb. Rastafarians believe cannabis brings spiritual enlightenment, connects them with Jah, their name for God, and was given to humanity for healing and meditation. They base this partly on Psalm 104 verse 14, "He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man." To Rastafarians, cannabis is that herb. Using it isn't recreation. It's sacrament. It's prayer. And in Jamaica, Rastafarian use of cannabis for religious purposes has legal protections. So here's the pattern. Across continents, across millennia, across different religions and spiritual traditions, humans have used cannabis to connect with something greater than themselves. Hindus, Zoroastrians, possibly ancient Israelites, Rastafarians, Sufis in some Islamic traditions, indigenous peoples in the Americas. All saw cannabis as sacred. And here's the thing. These weren't primitive people making mistakes. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex theologies, written texts, and centuries of tradition. They didn't use cannabis because they were ignorant. They used it because they found value in it. Spiritual value. Psychological value. Communal value. But in the 20th century, Western governments decided they knew better. They decided that thousands of years of religious practice were wrong. That sacred traditions were crimes. That spiritual experiences were drug abuse. And they criminalized it all. We'll get to why. But first, we need to talk about the other side of cannabis. The industrial side. Because before cannabis was medicine or sacrament, it was rope. And that rope built empires. Let's talk about hemp. Not the psychoactive kind. Industrial hemp. The kind that built navies, clothed armies, and quite literally held together the age of exploration. Because before cannabis became controversial, it was one of the most important crops in human history. And I'm not exaggerating. Hemp fibers are incredibly strong. Stronger than cotton. more durable than most natural materials. And they resist rot, which is critical if you're building ships that need to survive months at sea. For thousands of years, if you wanted rope that wouldn't snap, sails that wouldn't tear, and cloth that could withstand harsh conditions, you used hemp. There was no substitute. The ancient Egyptians used hemp rope. The Romans used it for their naval fleets. The Vikings used it in their longships. Every major maritime power in history relied on hemp. Without it, there would be no age of exploration. No Columbus sailing to the Americas. No Magellan circumnavigating the globe. Those ships needed miles and miles of rope, and it all came from hemp. Now let's jump to colonial America, the 1600s and 1700s. Hemp wasn't just legal. It was mandatory. Yes, you read that right. Several American colonies actually required farmers to grow hemp. Virginia passed a law in 1619 requiring every farmer to grow hemp. Connecticut and Massachusetts followed. If you didn't grow hemp, you could be fined. Why? Because the colonies needed rope and cloth, and hemp was the most reliable source. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. Extensively. His agricultural journals are full of entries about hemp cultivation. Sowed hemp at Muddy Hole by Swamp. Began to separate the male from female hemp. Too late to sow hemp this day. Washington wasn't getting high. He was running a business. Hemp was cash crop number one, more valuable than tobacco in some regions. Thomas Jefferson also grew hemp at Monticello. He designed a special break for processing hemp fibers, improving efficiency. Both Washington and Jefferson saw hemp as essential to American agriculture and industry. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, early drafts and copies, many were written on hemp paper. Not because it was rebellious. Because hemp paper was durable, high quality, and readily available. The first American flag, the Betsy Ross flag, was probably made from hemp cloth. The Conestoga wagons that carried settlers westward, their canvas covers were hemp. The ropes on whaling ships, hemp. The sails on naval vessels, hemp. The nation was quite literally woven together with cannabis fibers. And nobody thought twice about it. But here's where things get complicated. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, new materials emerged. Cotton became cheaper to process, thanks to the cotton gin. Steel cables replaced hemp ropes on ships. Synthetic fibers like nylon were invented in the 1930s. Hemp started to seem old-fashioned, less efficient, less profitable. The market was shifting. At the same time, something else was happening. Mexican immigrants were coming to the United States in larger numbers, especially after the Mexican Revolution in 1910. And they brought with them a tradition of smoking cannabis recreationally. They called it marijuana. Not hemp. Not cannabis. Marijuana. And suddenly, the same plant that American founding fathers had grown was being associated with foreigners, with Mexicans, with a different culture. American media began running sensational stories about marijuana madness. Newspapers claimed it made people violent, insane, and sexually deviant. Never mind that Americans had been using cannabis medicinally for decades. Never mind that hemp had been a staple crop for centuries. This was different. This was foreign. This was dangerous. Or so the propaganda claimed. The stage was being set for one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in American history. Hemp, medicine, and a plant that had served humanity for 10,000 years was about to become public enemy number one. Not because of science. Not because of medicine. But because of racism, corporate interests, and political ambition. And the man who orchestrated it all was named Harry Anslinger. But before we meet him, we need to talk about soldiers. Because cannabis has a long, strange history with warfare. And it's not what you think. Here's something they definitely didn't teach you in history class. Cannabis and warfare have been connected for thousands of years. And I'm not just talking about soldiers using it medicinally for pain. I'm talking about armies deliberately using cannabis before battle, during campaigns, and as part of military culture. Let's start with the Scythians again. These weren't just peaceful nomads sitting in tents getting high for fun. They were fierce warriors. Some of the most feared mounted archers in the ancient world. And according to multiple historical sources, they used cannabis before battle. Why? Possibly to reduce fear, increase aggression, or simply bond as a unit before facing death. Whatever the reason, it was part of their military culture. Fast forward to the medieval period. The word assassin supposedly comes from hashishin, Arabic for hashish users. The story goes that a sect of Nizari Ismailis in Persia, led by Hassan I Sabah in the 11th century, would consume hashish before carrying out political assassinations. The legend claims Hassan would drug his followers with hashish, show them a paradise garden, and convince them that's what awaited them in the afterlife if they died serving him. Now, modern historians debate whether this story is true or just propaganda spread by their enemies. The Crusaders certainly believed it and spread the tale throughout Europe. But whether it's fact or myth, the association stuck. Cannabis became linked, in Western imagination, with violence and fanaticism. Which is ironic, considering European soldiers would later use cannabis themselves. Jump to the Napoleonic Wars. French soldiers in Egypt encountered hashish and brought it back to France. By the 1840s, the Club de Hashishins, the Hashish Eaters Club, was meeting in Paris. Members included famous writers like Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and Charles Baudelaire. They weren't soldiers, but the cultural spread began with military contact. American Civil War, 1860s. Cannabis tinctures were standard issue in many military medical kits. Doctors used it to treat pain from battlefield injuries, help soldiers sleep despite the horrors they'd witnessed, and calm nerves before amputations, which were horrifyingly common. This wasn't recreational. This was frontline military medicine. World War II gets interesting. There's evidence that both Allied and Axis powers issued cannabis to troops in certain situations. The U.S. military grew hemp domestically during the Hemp for Victory campaign, ostensibly for rope and parachute webbing. But some accounts suggest cannabis was also used medicinally for shell shock, what we now call PTSD. Vietnam War, 1960s and 70s. This is where cannabis use among American soldiers became widespread and well documented. Soldiers in Vietnam had easy access to extremely potent cannabis grown locally. Some estimates suggest over half of American troops used it at least once during their deployment. It became part of the culture, a way to cope with the stress, boredom, and trauma of a deeply unpopular war. The military initially tried to crack down, but the problem was so widespread they couldn't control it. Soldiers smoked between patrols. They smoked in base camps. Some even smoked before operations, though this was less common than popular culture suggests. The cannabis in Vietnam was strong, cheap, and everywhere. And young men far from home, facing death daily, used it to cope. This terrified military leadership and American politicians. Because if soldiers were using cannabis and the war was going badly, maybe, they thought, the two were connected. Maybe cannabis was undermining military effectiveness. Never mind that soldiers in every war have used substances to cope, whether alcohol, tobacco, or worse. Cannabis became the scapegoat. When veterans came home, many continued using cannabis for what we now recognize as PTSD symptoms. Nightmares, anxiety, hypervigilance, insomnia. And the government's response? Arrest them. Criminalize them. Treat them like criminals instead of wounded veterans. It was cruel. It was short-sighted. And it was part of a larger pattern. Because by the time of the Vietnam War, cannabis was already illegal in America. The groundwork had been laid decades earlier by a man who weaponized racism and fear to turn a plant into a crime. A man who built his career on lies. A man named Harry Anslinger. And he's exactly where our story goes next. Because the 1930s were when everything changed. When medicine became madness. When racism became policy. And when the war on cannabis, and eventually the war on drugs, truly began. Now we meet the villain of our story. Harry Jacob Anslinger. Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962. For over 3 decades, this man shaped American drug policy. And his primary weapon wasn't science. It wasn't medicine. It was racism. Pure, undisguised, documented racism. Before Anslinger, cannabis was barely on the federal government's radar. It was in the pharmacopoeia. Doctors prescribed it. Some states had restrictions, but it wasn't a national issue. Then came the Great Depression, Prohibition's repeal in 1933, and suddenly the Bureau of Narcotics needed a new enemy. Alcohol was legal again. The Bureau needed to justify its existence and its budget. Anslinger needed a new demon. And he found it in marijuana. Notice the spelling. Not cannabis. Not hemp. Marijuana. A Mexican-Spanish term. Anslinger deliberately used this foreign-sounding word to associate the plant with Mexican immigrants. And his rhetoric was explicitly, horrifyingly racist. These aren't modern interpretations. These are his actual words, documented in official testimony and correspondence. Anslinger told Congress, there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. This wasn't private conversation. This was official government testimony. He wrote, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men." He claimed that, most marijuana smokers are Negroes, and their satanic jazz music is driving white women mad with desire for their company. He told stories, almost certainly fabricated or wildly exaggerated, about black and Mexican men committing violent crimes under the influence of marijuana. The goal was clear. Link marijuana with minorities. Link minorities with violence, sexual deviancy, and social disorder. Then criminalize marijuana and you have an excuse to control, arrest, and suppress those minority populations. It wasn't subtle. It was explicitly, deliberately racist. And it worked. Anslinger traveled the country giving speeches. He worked with newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, who ran sensational headlines about marijuana madness. Stories of axe murders, insanity, and sexual violence, all blamed on marijuana. Films like Reefer Madness from 1936 portrayed marijuana as turning normal people into raving lunatics. The propaganda was everywhere. Doctors and scientists pushed back. The American Medical Association opposed criminalization. They pointed out that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and that Anslinger's claims weren't supported by evidence. But Anslinger dismissed them. He had political power, media support, and he knew how to manipulate public fear. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. It didn't technically ban cannabis, but it imposed such heavy taxes and bureaucratic requirements that it effectively criminalized it. Growing, selling, or possessing cannabis without the proper tax stamps became a federal crime. And conveniently, the government made it nearly impossible to obtain those stamps. The law passed with minimal debate. Many congressmen didn't even realize they were criminalizing a plant that had been in the U.S. pharmacopoeia for nearly a century. The American Medical Association testified against it, but they were ignored. Industrial hemp farmers protested, but they were drowned out. The bill passed, and just like that, a plant humans had used for 10,000 years, a plant that had been medicine, rope, paper, and sacrament, became a crime. Not because of science. Not because of public health. But because of racism, political ambition, and corporate interests. Some historians argue that Hearst, who owned vast timber holdings, wanted to eliminate hemp as competition for paper production. DuPont was developing synthetic fibers and wanted to eliminate hemp competition. Follow the money, and you find more reasons for prohibition, but the racism was the selling point. The tool used to convince the public. And it worked because it tapped into existing prejudices. Fear of Black Americans during Jim Crow. Fear of Mexican immigrants during the Depression. Fear of social change. Cannabis became a scapegoat for all of it. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Doctors could no longer prescribe cannabis. Patients who had relied on it for decades lost access to their medicine. Jazz musicians, many of whom were black, were targeted and arrested. Mexican-American communities were raided. The criminalization didn't stop drug use. It just created criminals. And it set the stage for what would come next. Because Anslinger wasn't done. He spent the next 3 decades expanding cannabis prohibition internationally, pushing other countries to adopt similar laws. He worked with the United Nations to create international drug treaties that included cannabis. And he trained a generation of law enforcement and policymakers to see cannabis as dangerous, criminal, and worthy of harsh punishment. By the time Anslinger retired in 1962, cannabis prohibition was the law of the land. But the story doesn't end there. Because in the 1960s, something happened that Anslinger never anticipated. White middle-class kids started smoking marijuana. And when white kids started getting arrested, suddenly some people began questioning whether prohibition made sense. But the system Anslinger built was too powerful to dismantle easily. And another president was about to weaponize it even further. Richard Nixon became president in 1969. The country was in turmoil. The Vietnam War was raging and increasingly unpopular. The civil rights movement was demanding equality. The counterculture movement, hippies, protesters, was openly challenging traditional authority. And Nixon had enemies. Lots of them. Anti-war protesters. Black activists. The political left. He needed a way to target them. And he found it in the war on drugs. Here's the thing. We don't have to speculate about Nixon's motives. We know. Because his own advisors admitted it years later. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, gave an interview. And what he said should have shocked the nation. He said, and this is a direct quote, the Nixon campaign in 1968, and the Nixon White House after that, had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. He continued, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That's not conspiracy theory. That's a confession. The war on drugs was explicitly designed as a political weapon to target Nixon's enemies. Cannabis prohibition wasn't about public health. It was about social control. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act. This law created 5 schedules of controlled substances based on their potential for abuse and medical value. And cannabis was placed in Schedule 1. The most restrictive category. Schedule 1 means the government classifies it as having high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and unsafe even under medical supervision. Think about that for a second. The same plant that had been in the U.S. pharmacopoeia for a century. The same plant that Queen Victoria used for menstrual cramps. The same plant that Civil War doctors gave to wounded soldiers. Suddenly, officially, it had no accepted medical use. This wasn't based on science. It was political. Even Nixon's own commission disagreed with him. In 1972, the Schaefer Commission, officially the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, completed a comprehensive study. They interviewed experts. They reviewed medical literature. They examined the evidence. And their conclusion? Marijuana should be decriminalized. Personal use should not be a crime. The harms from prohibition far outweighed any harms from the drug itself. Nixon ignored them completely. He'd already made up his mind. Cannabis was Schedule 1, and it was staying there. And the enforcement was brutal. Arrests skyrocketed. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced. People were going to prison for years, decades even, for simple possession. Young men, disproportionately black and brown, were having their lives destroyed. The statistics are staggering. In 1970, there were about 400,000 drug arrests in America. By 2000, there were over 1.5 million. And the majority were for cannabis. Simple possession, not dealing, not trafficking, just having it. And who got arrested? Not white college kids, though they used cannabis at similar rates. Black Americans were, and still are, arrested for cannabis offenses at nearly 4 times the rate of white Americans, despite similar usage rates. This is what systemic racism looks like. A law that's technically neutral but enforced in a racially discriminatory way. And the consequences were catastrophic. Millions of people with criminal records, unable to get jobs, housing, or education. Families torn apart. Communities destabilized. All for a plant. By the 1980s, under Reagan, the war on drugs escalated further. Just Say No campaigns. More mandatory minimums. More militarized police. SWAT teams conducting no-knock raids. People dying in their homes. And asset forfeiture laws that allowed police to seize property without even convicting someone of a crime. If they suspected drugs, they could take your car, your house, your money. And good luck getting it back. The prison population exploded. In 1980, there were about 500,000 people in American prisons and jails. By 2010, it was over 2.3 million. The highest incarceration rate in the world. And a huge percentage were there for drug offenses, many for cannabis. The land of the free became the world's largest jailer. And cannabis prohibition was a major driver. But something else was happening. Research was continuing, despite the obstacles. Scientists were discovering the endocannabinoid system in the human body in the 1990s. They found that humans have natural cannabinoid receptors. That our bodies produce compounds similar to those in cannabis. That cannabis interacts with fundamental biological systems involved in pain, inflammation, mood, and memory. This wasn't pseudoscience. This was cutting-edge neuroscience. And patients were speaking out. People with AIDS wasting syndrome found cannabis helped them eat. Cancer patients found it reduced nausea from chemotherapy. People with epilepsy found it reduced seizures. Chronic pain patients found it worked when opioids failed. The evidence was mounting. Cannabis did have medical value. Lots of it. The government Schedule 1 classification was looking increasingly absurd. By the 2000s, states started to rebel. California legalized medical marijuana in 1996. Other states followed. The federal government pushed back, raiding dispensaries, arresting patients. But the movement grew. Public opinion shifted. And slowly, painfully, the wall of prohibition began to crack. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the medical renaissance, we need to understand what we lost. And what we're still fighting to regain. By the 1990s, something remarkable was happening. Patients were refusing to be silenced anymore. People with AIDS, cancer, epilepsy, chronic pain, they weren't asking for permission. They were demanding their medicine back. And they were willing to break the law to get it. The AIDS crisis was a turning point. In the 1980s and early 90s, thousands of young men were dying. Wasting syndrome was common, where patients couldn't eat, couldn't keep weight on, slowly starving despite having food. Chemotherapy for AIDS-related cancers caused horrific nausea. And conventional medicines weren't working well. But cannabis did. Patients discovered it stimulated appetite, reduced nausea, and helped them maintain weight. It wasn't a cure, but it helped them live. Activists in San Francisco and other cities started buyers clubs, underground cooperatives where patients could access cannabis. These weren't drug dealers. These were dying people helping other dying people. Dennis Perron, who lost his partner to AIDS, opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club. At its peak, it served thousands of patients. The police knew about it. Everyone knew about it. And for a while, they looked the other way, because shutting it down meant watching sick people suffer. But the federal government had other ideas. Raids happened. Arrests were made. Sick people were handcuffed. And public opinion started to shift. Because when the government is arresting cancer patients and people with AIDS, it's hard to claim you're protecting public health. The cruelty became undeniable. In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act. It legalized medical marijuana for patients with a doctor's recommendation. This was huge. A direct challenge to federal law. And it passed not by legislative action but by popular vote. The people spoke, and they said enough. The federal government threatened everyone. Doctors who recommended cannabis could lose their licenses. Dispensaries would be raided. Patients could still be arrested under federal law. But California stood firm. And other states started following. Oregon and Washington in 1998. Alaska and Maine in 1999. The dominoes were falling. Meanwhile, research was accelerating. In 1992, Israeli scientist Raphael Mechoulam discovered anandamide, the first endocannabinoid identified in the human body. The name comes from Ananda, Sanskrit for bliss. It turned out humans produce their own cannabis-like compounds naturally. We have CB1 and CB2 receptors throughout our bodies and brains. The endocannabinoid system regulates pain, inflammation, mood, appetite, memory, and more. This was revolutionary. Cannabis wasn't just some random plant that happened to get you high. It interacted with a fundamental biological system that every human has. The government's claim that cannabis had no medical value was becoming scientifically absurd. How could a plant that interacts with a major physiological system have no medical applications? Studies started emerging, despite the obstacles. Cannabis reduced seizures in epilepsy patients. Some children with severe epilepsy, who had hundreds of seizures per week and weren't responding to any medication, saw dramatic improvements with CBD-rich cannabis. Parents were watching their children have their lives back. And they weren't going to stay silent. Charlotte Figi became a famous case. She had Dravet syndrome, a severe form of epilepsy. By age 5, she was having 300 seizures per week. Pharmaceutical drugs weren't working. Her parents, desperate, tried a CBD-rich cannabis extract. Her seizures dropped to just a few per month. It was miraculous. The strain she used became known as Charlotte's Web. And her story helped change laws. More evidence accumulated. Cannabis helped veterans with PTSD sleep better and reduced nightmares. It helped chronic pain patients reduce or eliminate opioid use, which became critical during the opioid epidemic. Studies showed cannabis could slow tumor growth in some cancers. It reduced inflammation in conditions like Crohn's disease and arthritis. It helped glaucoma patients reduce eye pressure. The medical applications were vast. By the 2010s, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Polls showed majority support for medical marijuana. Even many conservatives supported it when they saw sick children benefiting. The human stories were too powerful. You can't watch a child with epilepsy have hundreds of seizures stop and then claim the medicine that helped them has no medical value. It doesn't work. States continued legalizing medical cannabis. By 2024, 38 states had some form of medical marijuana program. The federal government still classified it as Schedule I with no medical value, but the disconnect between federal law and reality was enormous. Millions of Americans were legally using medical cannabis under state law while committing federal crimes. And then came recreational legalization. Colorado and Washington led the way in 2012. Adults could legally purchase and possess cannabis. The sky didn't fall. Crime didn't skyrocket. Teens didn't all become addicts. In fact, teen use remained stable or even declined. Tax revenue flowed in, funding schools and drug treatment programs. It turned out legalization worked better than prohibition. More states followed. Oregon, Alaska, California, Massachusetts, Nevada, Michigan, Illinois. By 2024, nearly half of Americans lived in states with legal recreational cannabis. The industry created hundreds of thousands of jobs. Tax revenues reached billions of dollars. And arrest rates for cannabis offenses plummeted, meaning fewer lives ruined by criminal records. But here's the thing. Federal law hasn't changed. Cannabis is still Schedule I, banks won't work with cannabis businesses because it's federally illegal, forcing the industry to operate mostly in cash. Scientists still face enormous hurdles studying it. People still sit in federal prisons for cannabis offenses that are now legal in many states. Veterans can't use medical cannabis without losing VA benefits. The contradictions are everywhere. The medical renaissance proved what patients and doctors knew all along. Cannabis has medical value. Real, measurable, life-changing medical value. Prohibition was never about science or health. It was about politics and control. And slowly, painfully, we're correcting that historic injustice. But the fight isn't over. Not even close. Let's talk about what we actually know. Not what politicians claim. Not what propaganda says. What does the science actually tell us about cannabis? Because after decades of research, despite enormous obstacles, we have answers. And they're complicated. Cannabis isn't harmless. But it's not the demon drug we were told it was either. First, can cannabis be harmful? Yes. Absolutely. Smoking anything isn't great for your lungs. Heavy cannabis use during adolescence, when the brain is still developing, can affect memory and cognitive function. Some people develop cannabis use disorder, a real form of dependence, though it's far less addictive than alcohol, tobacco, or opioids. And for people predisposed to certain mental health conditions, particularly schizophrenia, heavy cannabis use can trigger or worsen symptoms. These are real risks. Researchers document them. Medical professionals warn about them. But here's the key. These risks don't justify prohibition. They justify education, regulation, and age restrictions. Just like we do with alcohol. Nobody's claiming alcohol is harmless, but we don't arrest adults for drinking wine. We regulate it, we educate people about risks, and we restrict access for minors. Now let's compare cannabis to legal substances. Alcohol kills about 95,000 Americans per year through overdose, accidents, liver disease, and violence. Tobacco kills about 480,000 per year. Opioid overdoses kill over 80,000 per year. How many people die from cannabis overdose annually? 0. Literally 0. There has never been a confirmed death from cannabis overdose alone. You physically cannot consume enough to cause fatal toxicity. This doesn't mean cannabis is perfectly safe. It means the risks are categorically different from substances that kill hundreds of thousands. Yet cannabis is Schedule I, classified as more dangerous than cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, which are all Schedule II. This makes no scientific sense. It's purely political. What about the gateway drug theory? The idea that cannabis leads to harder drug use. This was a cornerstone of prohibition rhetoric. And it's been thoroughly debunked. The National Academy of Sciences reviewed the evidence and found no causal link. Yes, many people who use hard drugs tried cannabis first. But they also probably drank alcohol and smoked cigarettes first. Correlation doesn't equal causation. The real gateway isn't the drug. It's the prohibition. When you buy cannabis illegally, you're interacting with a black market where dealers might sell other drugs. When you legalize and regulate cannabis, you separate it from that market. Studies from legalized states show no increase in hard drug use. If anything, some show decreases in opioid abuse because people substitute cannabis for more dangerous painkillers. What about driving under the influence? This is a legitimate concern. Cannabis impairs reaction time and judgment. Driving high is dangerous and should be illegal. But here's what the data shows. Cannabis impairs driving far less than alcohol. A drunk driver is about 13 times more likely to cause a fatal crash. A high driver is about 1.3 to 2 times more likely. Still risky, definitely illegal, but not remotely comparable to drunk driving, and we have tests for cannabis impairment now. Roadside sobriety tests work. Blood tests can detect recent use. The technology exists. We don't need prohibition to address impaired driving. We need good laws and enforcement. Just like with alcohol. Let's talk about the medicinal benefits again, because they're substantial. CBD, cannabidiol, one of cannabis's main compounds, is now FDA approved for treating certain severe epilepsies. That's right. The same government that says cannabis has no medical value approved a cannabis-derived medication. The contradiction is glaring. Beyond epilepsy, cannabis helps with chronic pain, which is huge given the opioid crisis. Studies show states with medical marijuana laws see reductions in opioid prescriptions and overdose deaths. Cannabis isn't as effective as opioids for acute severe pain, but for chronic pain, it works for many people without the addiction risk. Veterans with PTSD report significant benefits. Cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy find relief from nausea and appetite loss. The endocannabinoid system we discovered affects so many bodily functions that it's not surprising cannabis has diverse medical applications. But because it's Schedule 1, research is incredibly difficult. Scientists need DEA approval to study it. They can only use cannabis from one government-approved grow facility, which produces lower quality material than what's commercially available. It's absurd. What about mental health? This is complex. For some people, cannabis helps with anxiety and depression. For others, it makes anxiety worse, especially high THC strains. The key is individual variation in dosing. CBD tends to be anxiolytic, meaning it reduces anxiety. THC can increase anxiety in high doses but reduce it in low doses. It's not one size fits all. Here's what's become clear. Cannabis is a drug. It has benefits and risks. Like any drug, it should be used appropriately, with education about risks, especially for young people. It should be regulated to ensure quality and safety. Age restrictions make sense. But prohibition? Prohibition causes far more harm than cannabis itself ever could. It created a massive black market. It filled prisons. It destroyed lives with criminal records. It prevented medical research. It denied sick people access to medicine. And it was rooted in racism from the start. The truth is cannabis is far less dangerous than we were told. Not harmless, but certainly not deserving of Schedule 1 classification. Not deserving of arrest and imprisonment. Not deserving of the stigma that destroyed countless lives. The science is clear. The question is whether policy will finally catch up to reality. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in the medical and political debates. Cannabis culture. The art, music, literature, and social movements that grew around this plant. Because cannabis hasn't just been medicine or rope or a political football. It's been part of human creativity and community for thousands of years. We already mentioned the ancient rituals, the Scythians in their tents, the Hindu sadhus with Shiva. But cannabis culture evolved significantly in the modern era, particularly in the 20th century. And it's intimately tied to music, especially jazz. In the 1920s and 30s, jazz musicians in New Orleans and Harlem discovered cannabis. They called it tea, or gauge, or muggles. And many credited it with helping them improvise, stay relaxed during performances, and connect with the music on a deeper level. Louis Armstrong was an enthusiastic cannabis user his entire adult life. He wrote about it, talked about it, and believed it was far superior to alcohol. He once said it made him feel good all over and helped him unwind after performances. Cab Calloway had a hit song in 1932 called Reefer Man. Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, many of the greatest jazz musicians used cannabis. It became part of the culture. But here's the dark side. This association between jazz, black musicians, and cannabis was exactly what Harry Anslinger exploited. He used racist language to demonize both the music and the plant, linking them to fears about black culture influencing white youth. The cultural crackdown on cannabis was also a cultural crackdown on jazz and black artistic expression. Moving into the 1950s and 60s, cannabis culture spread to the beats. Writers like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William S. Burroughs wrote about cannabis use. Ginsberg became an outspoken advocate for legalization, arguing that prohibition was absurd and harmful. The Beats challenged conventional society, and cannabis was part of that rebellion. Not the cause of it, but a symbol of it. Then came the 1960s counterculture. This is when cannabis went mainstream, at least among young people. The hippie movement embraced cannabis as part of a broader rejection of straight society's values. Anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, musicians, artists, they were all part of a cultural revolution. And cannabis was there. Bob Dylan reportedly introduced the Beatles to cannabis in 1964. The Beatles went on to reference it in songs, though usually subtly. Got to Get You Into My Life is apparently about Paul McCartney's love of cannabis. The entire psychedelic rock movement, bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Pink Floyd, cannabis was woven into the creative process and the concert experience. This terrified the establishment. Not just because people were using drugs, but because cannabis became associated with questioning authority, opposing the Vietnam War, demanding civil rights. Cannabis culture was counterculture. And the crackdown on cannabis was partly a crackdown on that cultural rebellion. The 1970s saw cannabis culture normalize somewhat. It wasn't just hippies anymore. Regular people smoked. Comedy about cannabis became mainstream. Cheech and Chong built entire careers on cannabis humor. Their movies were huge hits. Up in Smoke in 1978 was a cultural phenomenon. Cannabis was becoming less taboo, at least in popular culture, even as the legal penalties were getting harsher. The 1980s were complicated. Reagan's war on drugs created fear and stigma. Just Say No campaigns tried to convince kids that cannabis was as dangerous as heroin. DRE programs in schools taught children that cannabis led to harder drugs, ruined lives, and caused brain damage. Much of this was exaggerated or false, but it shaped an entire generation's perception. Meanwhile, hip-hop culture was emerging, and cannabis was part of it. Rappers like Cypress Hill, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, they didn't hide their cannabis use. They celebrated it. Cypress Hill's album, Black Sunday, in 1993 featured songs explicitly about cannabis. Snoop Dogg became synonymous with cannabis culture. This was different from the subtle references of earlier eras. This was open, unapologetic celebration. And again, this made cannabis culture a target. The same racist dynamics that targeted jazz in the 1930s targeted hip-hop in the 1990s. Black artists celebrating cannabis were portrayed as dangerous influences. The cultural and racial politics never went away, but something else was happening. Cannabis culture was diversifying. It wasn't just musicians and artists. It was medical patients forming communities. It was activists organizing politically. It was entrepreneurs seeing business opportunities. By the 2000s, cannabis culture included soccer moms with anxiety, veterans with PTSD, cancer patients, entrepreneurs, scientists, and yes, still musicians and artists. The legalization movement created new cultural spaces. Dispensaries became community hubs. Cannabis lounges opened where legal. Industry events and conventions attracted thousands. Cannabis went from counterculture to culture, period. And that cultural shift helped drive political change. When your neighbor, your coworker, your family member uses cannabis, it's harder to demonize it. Today, cannabis culture is everywhere. There are cannabis cooking shows, lifestyle brands, wellness products, art exhibitions, film festivals, academic conferences. It's been normalized to a degree that would have seemed impossible in the 1980s. But that normalization is uneven. In some communities and demographics, cannabis use is seen as sophisticated, wellness-oriented, entrepreneurial. In others, particularly poor communities of color, it still results in arrests and criminal records. That's the uncomfortable truth about cannabis culture. It's been celebrated and criminalized, often depending on who's doing it and where. White college kids smoking at a music festival get a pass. Black teenagers in urban neighborhoods get arrested. The plant is the same. The culture around it is the same. But the consequences are wildly different. Cannabis has inspired art, music, literature, and community for thousands of years. It's helped people create, connect, and cope. It's been part of religious ceremonies and jazz clubs, beat poetry and hip-hop tracks, medical support groups and political movements. The culture around cannabis is rich, diverse, and deeply human. And as legalization spreads, that culture is finally being recognized and celebrated rather than criminalized. But we can't forget those still in prison, still carrying records, still suffering from the decades of prohibition. The culture survived. Not everyone did. So here we are. We've traveled from ancient China to modern America. From emperors and sadhus to jazz musicians and activists. From rope and medicine to crime and imprisonment. From 10,000 years of use to a century of prohibition. And the question remains, why does this history matter? It matters because the prohibition of cannabis was never about science or public health. It was about racism, political control, and corporate interests. Understanding that history helps us see through the propaganda. It helps us question other drug policies that might be similarly unjust. It reminds us that laws aren't always right just because they're laws. It matters because millions of people have been arrested, imprisoned, and had their lives destroyed over this plant. In the United States alone, there have been over 20 million cannabis arrests since 1965. 20 million. Most for simple possession. Young people, disproportionately black and brown, who now carry criminal records that affect employment, housing, education, and voting rights. That's not ancient history. That's ongoing. Even as states legalize, people still sit in prison for offenses that are now legal. Some are serving life sentences for nonviolent cannabis offenses under mandatory minimum laws. Life sentences. For a plant. While others are making millions in the legal cannabis industry. The injustice is staggering. And it's directly connected to the racist origins of prohibition. It matters because we lost decades of medical research. Imagine if scientists had been freely studying cannabis for the past 50 years. How many more treatments might we have discovered? How many people suffered unnecessarily because medicine was classified as crime? We're playing catch-up now, trying to understand a plant we've kept in the dark for generations. It matters because the same patterns of prohibition, the same propaganda tactics, the same racial disparities, they apply to other drugs too. The war on drugs as a whole has been catastrophic. Mass incarceration. Militarized police. Destabilized communities. violence from black markets, and very little actual reduction in drug use. Understanding cannabis prohibition helps us understand the broader failures of drug policy. It matters because history repeats itself when we don't learn from it. Right now, there are moral panics about other substances. There are calls for harsher penalties, more enforcement. And the same racist rhetoric appears, just with different targets. If we understand how cannabis prohibition was built on lies and bigotry, we can recognize those same tactics when they're used again. But it also matters because this history shows change is possible. Cannabis prohibition seemed permanent, inevitable, unchangeable. The government, the media, the criminal justice system, they all supported it. And yet, activists, patients, scientists, and voters changed it. Not everywhere, not completely, but significantly. That's hopeful. It means other unjust policies can change too. The history of cannabis teaches us to question authority, to demand evidence, to recognize when laws serve power rather than justice, to understand how racism gets coded into policy, to see how corporate interests shape legislation. These are lessons that apply far beyond cannabis. It also teaches us about resilience. The plant survived. The cultures around it survived. The medical knowledge survived, even when suppressed. People kept using it, kept studying it, kept fighting for it, despite the risks. That kind of persistence changes the world. So what now? The fight isn't over. Cannabis is still federally illegal in the United States. People are still in prison. Communities are still dealing with the aftermath of decades of over-policing. The legal industry is still largely inaccessible to those most harmed by prohibition, because criminal records prevent them from getting licenses and banks won't lend to them. We need federal legalization and descheduling. We need to expunge cannabis criminal records automatically, not make people jump through bureaucratic hoops. We need to release everyone in prison for nonviolent cannabis offenses immediately. We need to direct cannabis tax revenue to communities most harmed by prohibition. We need to ensure the legal industry includes people from those communities, not just wealthy entrepreneurs swooping in. We need to continue researching cannabis medically. We need to educate honestly about risks and benefits, not with propaganda but with science. We need to treat cannabis like what it is, a plant with uses and risks that should be regulated sensibly, not criminalized brutally. And we need to remember. Remember the 20 million arrests. Remember the racist origins. Remember the lives destroyed. Remember the sick people denied medicine. Remember the activists who fought despite the risks. Remember that this injustice happened, is still happening, and vigilance is required to prevent it from happening again with other substances or other marginalized communities. Cannabis is just a plant. But its history is the history of power, prejudice, and resistance. It's the history of science suppressed by politics. Of medicine criminalized for profit. Of cultures targeted for being different. And of people fighting back, slowly, persistently, until justice began to prevail. The story of cannabis is far from over. But understanding where we've been helps us see where we need to go. Toward justice. Toward evidence-based policy. Toward healing the harms of prohibition. Toward a future where we learn from history instead of repeating it. So the next time someone tells you cannabis has always been illegal, or that prohibition is about protecting people, or that the war on drugs is necessary, you'll know better. You'll know the real history. The uncomfortable, racist, political history. And maybe, just maybe, you'll help make sure we don't make the same mistakes again. Thanks for joining me on this journey through cannabis history. It's been long, it's been dark, but hopefully it's been enlightening. Now you know. And knowing is the first step toward change. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. And never stop questioning the stories you're told, especially by those in power. Good night, and sleep well.